Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to have Nathaniel Dog from NYU. Nathaniel studied philosophy and physics at Columbia University and then moved to do his PhD in computer science at Carnegie Mellon. After that, he moved to Gatsby and worked there with Peter Dayan on reinforcement learning. And since 2007, he's a professor at NYU at the Center for Neuroscience, Department of Psychology, and Center for Neuroeconomics. Is that correct? Nathaniel, please.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for inviting me, which is hard to wear this. It's really exciting to be back here. Had a good time talking to everyone. Let's see. So I'd like to start by giving my acknowledgments because I always forget at the end. I'm going to talk today mainly about work I did with Sam Gershman, Ross Otto, Dylan Simon, and Seth at NYU. Also in collaboration with some of my collaborators in London, including ICNC Zonia El-Niv. I'm interested in our lab. We work on reinforcement learning, on decision making by trial and error, learning to obtain rewards or avoid punishments. And the question that we've been thinking about a lot for the past few years is the idea that there are really multiple systems in the brain for doing this that are both neurally and psychologically dissociable. And what I'd like to tell you about today is our attempts to understand this distinction, which is in some ways a long-standing one in psychology and neuroscience, in a computational sense, in terms of different strategies or rules or approaches for learning, which we've called model-based and model-free reinforcement learning. Theorists in computer science have called model-based and model-free reinforcement learning. What I'd like to do today is tell you about how we've been able to somewhat to distinguish the contribution of these two strategies to the behavior of humans and also to neural signals related to this learning in the brain. So the outline of the talk basically is talk first about sort of the traditional story about reinforcement in the brain, dopamine and so on, and how it drives trial and error learning. And then what there's other than that, additional influences, model-based reinforcement learning or cognitive maps and sort of planning using more abstract learning. So the idea that the brain has kind of multiple systems for decisions or control is a really old one, and a really kind of ubiquitous one, I think, to this day, particularly in different parts of psychology, behavioral economics, and systems neuroscience. And you can see it even back in Plato. So Plato analogized the soul to a team of horses, a good horse and a bad horse, and the good horse is guided by verbal commands. The bad horse is wild and beastly, and it has to be whipped. And I think this is an interesting. I think this problem, this idea is very ubiquitous in a sort of popular thinking about how the brain works, and it's very problematic, as you can see even here. One problem is that if you have a decision-making system, then you have a decision-making system. If you have two decision-making systems, then you haven't solved the decision-making problem at all. You've just pushed it up a level. So you have to have a charioteer to decide which horse, drives the carriage. So you have this sort of homunculus. You have a new decision problem, the meta-decision problem over decision systems. So that's one problem that doesn't get a lot of, I think, attention. Another problem, which is practical, which is if you're trying to do an experiment, looking at behavior, then behavior is ambiguous because there's one body that's, if it's controlled by two controllers, you have to try to tease apart the influences of these two controllers on the behavior, which gives rise to very complicated experimental procedures and arguments and trying to do anything under these circumstances. And the final thing I think is interesting about this idea is that it's in many conceptions of drug abuse and other problems of compulsion, it's deeply tied up with ideas of self-control. So you have the good horse that's guided by language and knows what's good for it, and you've got the bad horse that's beastly and does beastly things. And again, I think this idea is at the heart of a lot of contemporary ideas about the problems that are involved in drug abuse and problem gambling and problem eating and so on. And so I think it's an important issue. The other piece of background I'd like to sort of jump off from, of course, is this idea that's been worked on in Hagai's group here and by others, that the brain's dopamine system is involved in this kind of trial and error reward learning. So of course, famously, dopamine is supplied to interesting parts of the forebrain by a couple of small clusters of neurons in the midbrain with diffuse ascending projections. And these neurons first recorded, these responses reported by Wolfram Schultz in this kind of task, sort of famously seem to be sensitive to rewards and predictions, and in particular in the theoretical models by Peter Dayan and Reid Montague, it was argued that these neurons report something like the difference between received and expected rewards, or reward prediction error. And so I won't retell that story today, but that story is an important story. I think it in some ways represents the predominant view in systems neuroscience about how the brain solves these kind of reward-guided decision problems, in particular by a mechanism which in psychology is known as the law of effect. So the idea is these neurons project a striatum, where there are, of course, neurons that, medium spiny neurons that control, can help produce or suppress behaviors. And this prediction error signal can drive plasticity on those neurons and therefore drive changes in action strategies such that if an action is reinforced, the idea is then it'll drive positive prediction error and an increase in the chance of choosing that action. If a negative prediction error happens something worse than expected, that action might be reduced in the future. And that strategy, repeating what works, is going back to Thorndike in the early 20th century, a sort of simple idea about how the brain learns from experiences. If something's followed by reward, then do it more. something's followed by punishment, do it less. Now, as we'll see, embarrassingly, although this I think is a mechanism we understand very well in the brain, and it's very popularly cited in this context, psychologically, it's clear that this kind of learning is, if not wrong, then at least incomplete, and there's much more to the story than that, and as was known for a century. One other thing I just want to mention about this system, because it's my own experimental technique. Of course, these neurons are recorded from putative dopamine-containing neurons in the midbrain. But in humans, if you do a similar experiment, a similar task involving rewards and choices and so on, and you write down, using these computational models, a time series of what you think a kind of Wolfram-Schultz prediction error dopamine neuron would be doing at every time point in the task, and then you ask, where in the brain does the measured bold signal in fMRI correlate with the predicted signal that you would think a dopamine neuron would be producing in that task? What you see is, it's hard to get it all in one slice, but it looks very much like the entire ascending dopaminergic projection kind of lights up. And in particular, the ventral striatum, which is also the region of densest dopaminergic projection in the brain, I think, has a very strong correlation with the prediction error signal, such that if you just, as Yael did, take it out and average it and plot it in the manner that Wolfram plots dopamine neurons, you get a very similar picture. Now, of course, if we're looking at prediction errors in the bold signal fMRI, we're not looking at something specific to dopamine. We can't say that it's dopamine, of course. It's a metabolic signal. It's blood oxygenation. But there are some reasons to think from pharmacology and patient studies that dopamine is involved in this signal that we're looking at in humans. But of course, it's not the only thing. I believe it's scans. So I mean, this is just a demonstration of the sort of thing we write down. But I think each count represents 3 seconds, which is the repetition cycle of the fMRI scanner. Could be 1 second. It's either seconds or triplets of seconds. What's that? It could either be seconds or 3 seconds. I'd have to think which is. Can't tell by looking at it. But this just represents the sort of thing that we do a correlation of a time series generated from the experiment with the bold signal in the human. Okay. So how do we study these sorts of issues in people? So we've done a great deal of work now using what's called bandit tasks. So the canonical sort of task is people choose repeatedly between a set of slot machines. On each trial, say on some particular trial, they choose the red one, and we give them some outcome, say money or an electric shock. And they make another choice and another, maybe 300 times, and that's the experiment. Now we've done this a bunch in people. This has been done a lot, including here in Hagai's group with monkeys. Yonatan has looked at the same sort of issues in field data, that's human basketball players. This is a common result across a number of species and settings. One issue about the way we do these experiments is that because we're interested in looking at learning, we keep the results of the outcomes non-stationary. So for instance, if I chose the blue slot machine in this experiment as a function of trials, the probability that I'd get a shock on the first trial is like 26%, and that probability is diffusing in a Gaussian random walk, so that later on in the experiment, that probability is much lower. The probability of getting rewarded at the start in this particular experiment on this particular slot machine was low, and it becomes higher and lower. So subjects have to keep learning and keep adjusting their behavior in response to outcomes to try and maximize reward and avoid punishment. And this allows us not to waste our time looking at them making the same choice over and over again. So the behavior in this sort of task, just in a raw sense, looks something like this. So this is 100 trials from a subject in one of these studies. In this case, it wasn't rewards and shocks. It was different amounts of money. So what's the x-axis is the trial, and the y-axis is the amount of money they got. The color is which option they chose. So they chose the green option for a while, and we're doing well. It starts to get worse, so they switch and they hunt around blue and red, and that's not doing as well. So then they switch to the yellow, and they stick with that for a while, and so on. So what you have is a series of choices conditioned on a series of payoffs that we give. And now we can try to understand the learning, that is, the function that relates the outcomes we give the subject to the choices they make in the future. What's plotted here is a regression coefficient from a logistic regression analysis, which the dependent variable is the choice they make on a particular trial, and the explanatory variables are the outcomes on previous trials. So this regression coefficient says if subjects have chosen a particular slot machine on the previous trial and they're rewarded for it, their four logits are more likely to choose it again on trial T. Now, if I had chosen a slot machine 2 times ago and rewarded for it, or 3 times ago, or 4 times ago, that also promotes choosing the slot machine. But this effect falls off reasonably rapidly in this delay. So by 10 trials ago, there's not much effect left. So rewards drive choices. That's the law of effect, right? If I choose something, I'm reinforced for it, I'm likely to do it again. Comfortingly, shocks have the opposite effect. If I choose an option, I'm shocked for it. I'm driven away from it, and that also falls off rapidly in time. One reason this analysis is interesting is because these error-driven prediction error learning rules of the sort associated with the dopamine response predict a particular pattern in this analysis. They predict that these regression weights should decay exponentially in this lag, so they should start high and fall off. And you can see it's a reasonably good approximation of the data, which weren't fit according to that assumption. They were fit according to just the assumption of linearity. Indeed, if I refit the data, the same choice data, under that assumption, and then plot the data, revisualize the result in the same way, this is what I get, and it, cleaned up, but again, a reasonable match. And in fact, this model, which has fewer parameters accounting for that, is actually a better fit to the data than the more general model on the left. We haven't taken into account, there's not a lot of variation in risk among the alternatives here, because it's just a probability. So I guess it's a binomial variance changes as the probability moves. But we don't have an option that's has more or less standard deviation or something, right? We don't have a safe option and a risky option. We just have different probabilities of being rewarded and punished. Certainly, in data like Yonatan's looked at, where you do have that distinction, people have risk sensitivity. But that doesn't really come into these data. And you have to augment this model to really account for some of that.
But I didn't understand your answer, because
Sorry.
here you were talking about the probability of avoiding shock. So this can be, it does not relate to the task that you are
the risk ambiguity. I mean the risk shock.
Oh yeah, so this shows that they're driven away from shocks. If that's what you mean by risk averse, then absolutely.
For the shock is smaller than the amplitude for the reward.
Yeah, so that's a question of how bad the shock is compared to how big the reward is. So we did some piloting, moving those around. This is about, so this is 20 pence, and this is worth about 11 pence in terms of its height. So you can actually quantify from this kind of analysis how bad the shock is relative to how good the reward is in units of pence, British pence. And that's something that comes out of this sort of automatically from the scale of these effects. And if we made the shocks worse, we can steer this relationship. Yeah. This is the TD model. The left is a generic multinomial logistic regression that simply expresses the choices in terms of past outcomes. And the TD model is a special case of that, where those regression weights follow up exponential. And that special case is a pretty good approximation. And that's one reason people historically have thought this learning rule, this behavioral evidence for this learning rule. Okay, so now we come to the anecdote part of the talk about why this is not a sufficient model. So I prefer sushi to these sort of flat hamburgers. And so therefore, because of that, I prefer Nobu, which is a fabulous sushi restaurant in New York, to McDonald's, which is like Burger Ranch, only worse. And this wavy greater than sign is economist notation for I prefer this to that. Now, and because I prefer Nobu to McDonald's, when I'm out in the street, I prefer to get on the C train instead of the A train to go to dinner and so on. And all this was true until one day I woke up in the morning and opened the newspaper, and the New York Times had snuck out of a bunch of sushi restaurants with bags of tuna and sent them to a lab, and found they were all spectacularly poisonous. And there's these sort of alarming tables of, the best sushi restaurants in New York and alarming levels of mercury in the sushi, plots, of how rich you are against the blood level of mercury in your body, because if you're more rich, you eat more sushi.
It's non-kosher.
Tuna's kosher. This is absolutely kosher. That's right. There's the slicing spicy issue with sushi, but tuna's fine. Okay. So anyway, of course now I prefer the hamburger to the tuna, right? Because I don't want to be poisoned. And this raises a question, which is if I'm back out on the street, which train am I going to get on, right? Which restaurant am I going to go to? And of course, in some ways the answer is obvious, right? If I don't want the sushi, instead I want the hamburger, I should go to McDonald's. But it's obvious because of a particular kind of reasoning, a sort of planning reasoning, which is I think in my head, if I get on the C train and go to Nobu, and I'll get sushi, and sushi is poisonous, whereas if I get on the A train and go to McDonald's, I can get a hamburger, and hamburger is not poisoning. And that's important because that's not the way these kind of law of effect reinforcement learning systems work. The way law of effect reinforcement learning systems work is I get on the train, I get rewarded, and so I'm more likely to get on this train again. Right? So what I have at the end of the learning from that kind of a system, if that's all I have, is the propensity to go to Nobu and a propensity not to go to McDonald's. And if I learn that I don't want tuna, that doesn't tell that system anything, because the tuna has nothing to do with it. I've just developed a reinforcement propensity to go to Nobu. So those reinforcement kind of models associated with dopamine predict that I should stand on the street, I should go to Nobu anyway, and it's only when I order the tuna and I'm now punished by realizing I'm going to poison myself that I update my values and correct my behavior for next time. So they predict a kind of odd misbehavior in this kind of circumstance.
But why can the negative reward be the article?
Because it has to be related to the action, right? So if all I've stored is a bunch of propensities to take actions, a sort of policy or generic expected values, then the fact that tuna is bad or hamburgers are good or something doesn't match up with anything that's in my representation. The way these algorithms work is by learning a policy, right? And the policy doesn't refer to tuna, right? So there are other algorithms that do, and this is, I think, the point that maybe you're getting at. So the states, we can talk about, there's something about that we can talk about in a sec. But one way to, I think, maybe clarify what's going on here is by thinking about, again, kind of how an economist would view the situation. So if I'm trying to learn in a situation where the different actions with different values and the different outcomes, like sushi and the actions of like getting on different trains, then what I'm trying to maximize in some sense is the expected value, expected utility of the action. Right? So when I choose the action that maximizes this equation, and that's defined as the average over all the different outcomes I might get if I go to the restaurant, like the menu of the restaurant, times the value of the different options. Right? So if I wanted to learn this problem by trial and error, how to choose good actions, I could really imagine working on either side of this equation. Right? On the right-hand side of the equation, I can write down or learn the menu of each of the restaurants. I can keep track of how much I like the different things on the menu. And then when it comes time to make a decision when I'm standing on the street, I can think through all the different items and all the different train destinations or whatever and add them up and compute the value of the action. Or I can just keep track of all the different actions, how good they are, like how much I enjoyed them, just a number, forgetting whether it was from tuna or hamburgers or anything else, and just work on the left-hand side of the equation. And if just working on the left-hand side of the equation is essentially, it's called model-free reinforcement learning, it's this strategy that's associated with dopamine these models, the simple temporal difference learning models of the dopamine response. And working on the right-hand side of the equation in reinforcement learning, computer science is known as model-based reinforcement learning, because what you learn is not just a set of action propensities or action values. What you learn is a sort of broken down representation of how the world works, which you can then sort of compute net values from at decision time. And now I hope it's clear that if you're working on the right-hand side of this equation, and I tell you that tuna is no good, then that's going to change this. That's telling you about the value of tuna, and that's going to change what actions you want to take, because you're recomputing that whenever you make a decision. But if I'm working on the left-hand side, I just have a table of trains and how good my experience has been after I got on those trains, then telling me tuna is no good is not going to do anything for me. And so I should be able to update my behavior on the right, but not on the left. So again, these dopamine TD models make a particular prediction about your behavior in this kind of a setting. And this experiment has been done in rats, particularly by Tony Dickinson and his trainees. And the way he set it up is as follows. Rats lever press, say, for different outcomes, different kinds of food. You have one lever press leading to some kind of food, another leading to another. And then what you want to do, after having trained the rat about this relationship between actions and outcomes, is develop an aversion so they don't want one of the outcomes. So you can pair that outcome with illness, or you can make the animal selectively fed to satiety on it, such that you can verify the animal doesn't want the food anymore and won't eat it if you give it to them. And then you give them a choice test. In extinction, you ask, will the animal work for food he doesn't want, demonstrably? And again, the prediction of these law of effect kind of dopamine TD learning algorithms is that animals should perfectly happily, if that's how they work for the food they don't want. And the answer to the experiment is actually they do that sometimes. This is a good description of some kinds of behavior in some circumstances. So in particular, if the animals were trained extensively on the lever pressing in this first phase, if they did it for 20 days, 20-hour-long sessions or something like that, and then you do the taste aversion. The taste aversion still works perfectly well. The animals don't want the food. But if you ask them to lever press just as much for food they want as for food they don't want. Consistent with this kind of law of effect. They're just lever pressing based on a propensity to lever press. On the other hand, if you do the same probe after moderate training, after perhaps 3 or 5 sessions of behavioral training in the first phase, then animals will selectively reduce their behavior for the devalued option. The lever press, they'll work less for the food they don't want than for the food they do. And this can't be explained by the law of effect. This involves understanding the consequences of the action and adjusting your behavior based on the particular consequences, not just a general reinforcement. And so what's come out of these experiments in psychology is an idea that behavior, this kind of behavior, instrumental conditioning behavior in rats at least, it really has 2 modes, which are dissociable by this kind of test. Devaluation insensitive behavior, this habitual behavior they call it, which matches well this dopamine model, free model that I've been talking about, and a devaluation sensitive sort of behavior like this, which they refer to as goal-directed, and can be understood in reinforcement learning terms as this kind of right-hand side of the equation is model-based reinforcement learning. Learning a model of the task and choosing on that basis. And so we suggested the psychological distinction could be sort of mapped onto this computational distinction in a modeling paper, and in particular that this habitual side of the behavior seems like it corresponds quite well to what we already think we know about the dopamine system. So that was sort of an idea, and that moreover we could have a sort of computational theory of the other thing, this goal-directed thing, about which is less known about the neural substrate. So this sort of manipulation of rats has also been done with lesions, and it is clear that these 2 behavioral modes are also neurally dissociable, so different sets of lesions in different corticostriatal loops will selectively abolish either the goal-directed or the habitual component of the lever pressing, leaving behavior always looking like this or always looking like this. So there's a neural reality to this distinction as well. This is just to remind me to say again that this fits well with the dopamine story, but only the habitual part of it. So this is exactly what's predicted. This is exactly what's predicted by the traditional temporal difference learning story. Okay, so the other thing about this theory is it tries to address a couple of the questions I raised at the beginning with the charioteer example, sort of why have multiple systems question and the charioteer question of when you should favor each of them. And so our claim was really that these two reinforcement learning strategies or algorithms working on these two sides of the equation to solve the learning problem represent a sort of trade-off in two dimensions. On the one hand, you have computational efficiency, so it's easier to have a table of what works and repeat what works. You don't have to do any computation at decision time. And the other is statistical efficiency. So I have a small amount of experience. I've been to a few restaurants a few times, and my experience is noisy. I want to make the best possible use of that experience to compute my decision variables and make the best choices and get the most reward. As we've seen, these kind of law of effect reinforcement model-free strategies can make mistakes. They don't use experience in the most statistically optimal way. So when you don't have a lot of experience, there might be pressure to rely more on computation, this model-based deliberation, to do a better job squeezing the most reward you can out of your experience. And this in turn leads to a sort of meta theory, at least, of when the brain might or should trade off these two options. So it's in a sense, in some situations, the cost of computational efficiency and statistical efficiency trade off in different amounts. So if I've been lever pressing for 20 days and always gotten the same outcome and it's always been good, then there's little value, in a sense, to spending time and calories and spikes deliberating about recomputing the value of the lever press in terms of anticipating which food it leads to and whether I want that food when this task has been stable for 20 days. So the costs of deliberation to computational efficiency seems to weigh, in that case, in favor of just doing what works. So that's why you might have a habit system and when you might use a habit system in that kind of situation. And so that example sort of shows you why you might have a shift from model-based, some computationally expensive model-based behavior to the computationally cheap model-free behavior as you gain more experience, right? And there are a number of other circumstances in which it's known that rats favor either system, and this model explains a number of these manipulations. It also makes new predictions, which I'll come back to, which are that things like if the task is more volatile, as it shows you our outcomes are changing, if they change faster, then you have less practice, the world's not stable, then you have more pressure, it's worth it more for you to plan, to recompute, and we should see you're more model-based, right? And we'll test that later on. The other question which we had and still have very little to say about is how does this model-based system work? So again, we have at least a cartoon of how model-free reinforcement learning works in the brain, and we have for a long time, but these model-based computations are much less understood. So this is something we've been starting to think about. So that sets us up for sort of the rest of the talk. So the question is whether we can really take these computational models and leverage them to solve the sort of practical problems with distinguishing these different systems contributions and really understand these processes now in human experiments. Now I want to mention one thing, which is it's possible, and we've done a little of this and other people have as well, to use these traditional designs involving devaluations and similar things to study these issues in humans. But it's clearly not ideal. I mean, poisoning people is not fun, and also the whole kind of multi-phase nature of this kind of study is ill-suited to fMRI. So, fMRI is a noisy technique. You don't have a lot. You want to average over a lot of data, and so having this kind of one-shot manipulation where you do this probe task and then it's over is really not ideal. You'd like to be able to kind of scan for a long time and collect information in a more kind of steady way and try to understand things. So that's why we turn back to these bandit tasks. So the bandit tasks I've shown you so far, in which I make a choice and immediately get the outcome for it, actually don't make a clear distinction or don't really reveal the difference between model-based and model-free reinforcement learning. They can't really tell the difference between goals and habits. So I could do a devaluation study and try and figure out now if the US dollar lost a lot of value, do you shift your behavior around or not? That would be one way to go. But we can do something else, which is add kind of multiple levels of choices. So what we did is develop a sort of two-step decision task, kind of similar to this example of what restaurant do I go to and what food do I get there, which I make a choice, And so at each trial, each subject receives a choice between two of these options, which are, again, kind of slot machines described by Tibetan characters here of a particular color. So they choose between two green options. If they choose the left one, then they don't just get money or shocks, they get another choice. So now they get a choice between two pink bandits with different symbols on them. And that bandit is a game like before. So if I choose this one, I get reward a British pound with some probability. And choose this one, I get money with some other probability. These probabilities are changing over time. And had I made the other choice at the top level, I would get a different option at the bottom level. Okay? So I could choose the right one. I would tend to get these blue choices for different amounts of reward. And my problem as the subject is to make the top level choices that lead to the bottom level choices that give me the best chance of getting reward. So I've got to continually be learning about these bottom level values and how to make the top level choices to get to them. Now, the other thing the importance of which will become clear in a second is that this coupling from the top level to the bottom level is imperfect. So 70% of the time, if the subject chose the left slot machine here, they would get the pink options. But on 30% of the trials, which I'll refer to as the rare trials, they get the blue options instead. And the reason this is important, and the reason for this whole design, is that having these multiple steps allows us to dissociate whether subjects are deciding to choose the green slot machine by considering the pink slot machines and the blue slot machines, or working directly on the basis of reinforcement. So if I think forward through multiple steps, that's different from thinking backward in terms of past reinforcement in a way that's not true in a flat bandit situation. And to see that, let me give you an example of a trial that distinguishes these two approaches. So what we want to look at is how does feedback at the bottom level in a particular trial change my choices at the top level on the next trial. So say I chose the left slot machine here, and this happens rarely, but only sometimes. I got the blue slot machine instead of the pink one. Now say I chose this one, and I got rewarded for it. So at the margin, this trial is going to change. It's going to drive learning. It's going to change my preference over these two slot machines by some amount and in some direction. So if I'm following model-free reinforcement learning, if I'm following TD1 for the aficionados, temporal difference learning 1, the law of effect, then I repeat what works. So I chose this action. I got rewarded for it. So I should, at the margin, be more likely to choose this action again on the next trial. Okay? However, that's actually kind of crazy, right? If you actually understand how the task works, what you really learned here is that this slot machine is better than you might have thought it was. And in order to have the best chance of repeating that outcome, what you need to do is actually choose the other option, which is more likely to lead you to the blue slot machines, right? So after this kind of a trial, if I'm doing model-based reinforcement learning, if I'm considering each option in terms of its consequences in terms of pink and blue slot machines, like sushi or hamburgers, then I will learn just the opposite. I will learn that this sort of trial favors choosing the other slot machine, the right one that I chose previously. The meaning of the reward is kind of inverted because of the symmetry and the probabilities. Okay, so that's the sort of logic of the design. And that allows us to make some predictions. One way of just visualizing the data and the predictions is to plot the chance that I'm going to make a particular choice on trial T. It's particularly the same choice I made on trial T minus 1 as a function of two factors, whether I was rewarded or not on the previous trial, whether that reward or not followed a common or rare transition. Okay? And so what I just finished saying is that model-free reinforcement learning ignores the transition structure. It just repeats what works, so there's no interaction with the factor of common or rare. There's the main effective reward. If I'm rewarded, I'm more likely to choose the same thing again than if I'm not. Okay? So this is the one trial effects of rewards. On the other hand, model-based reinforcement learning, if I'm planning down the tree, evaluating the options, then the meaning of reward reverses as a function of a rare transition such that it favors the opposite outcome. And you predict this kind of crossover interaction between the two factors. Now what we actually expected and fortunately achieved was some kind of mixture of both strategies, right? So we figured that we wanted to sort of titrate things so we're in the regime where subjects, we think that subjects have both these strategies in their brain, right? We want to be able to elicit both of them together and then do a brain imaging study. And that's indeed what we saw. So this is from our first brain imaging study. This is the average over 17 subjects, 201 trials. there is indeed a main effective reward, so subjects are more likely to choose a reward option than not, just like temporal difference learning. But the effect of a rare transition is not to completely reverse that, but to attenuate that effect, showing there's also a significant interaction with rare. Subjects treat rare trials differently from common trials. So this means a few things. One thing is that these results reject these kind of pure reinforcement models. So simple TD1, TD0 don't pay any attention to the state transition, the pink and blue state, so they can't treat rare and common trials differently. Subjects treat them differently, significantly so. And instead, they suggest that subjects are mixing planning and reinforcement processes. So you have some of the one pattern, some of the other pattern in some combination. And this is an average over trials and subjects. Many individuals also look at this. This is not just that we have some model-free subjects and some model-based subjects, but it could be they're switching across trials.
So there is a model, a mixture model, or the mixture just said that we don't have a model?
So we have a mixture model, but we'll get to that in a bit. Right now, this is a regression model in which you have a factor of the mean and a factor of the interaction. And again, I'm going to now visualize the data that way. So if we assume that this behavior arises from the combination of a TD system and a model-based system, we can also plot, and what I'll do from now on, because it's easy to look at, the size of the main effective reward, the TD effect, the model-free effect, and the size of the interaction. And what we see in this data set, on average over subjects, is a bit more TD, but significant amounts of each under that structural assumption. Okay. So, of course, that is an assumption, and perhaps these aren't really two systems. Maybe we're thinking about it wrong, and there's some other explanation for the behavior. It doesn't really arise from the superposition of these two systems. So the first thing we did to look at that is to look at a manipulation that we thought would impact the balance between these systems if there were really two of them. And so we looked at kind of classic cognitive neuroscience, cognitive psychology of kind of dual system theories. And one thing that people often think is that the more deliberative systems are more sensitive to interference by working memory load and other kinds of load manipulation. So we did a dual task manipulation in which either between groups or between trials within subjects, subjects were either doing the same task as before, in which case we replicated the previous result of getting a mixture of both kinds of patterns, or a dual task situation in which subjects had at the beginning of the trial, if it was a trial singled out for the dual task condition, they had to memorize a couple of numbers and a couple of letters and answer a question about them at the end of the trial. So they make a couple choices, get a reward, but they've had to have kept in mind these letters and numbers the whole time. So there's a working memory load they have online during the trial in these dual task trials. So we can just compare those two types of trials, or those two types of subjects, in both studies the data look the same. And what we see is, what we predicted, and I should give you the prediction before I show you the data, is that would selectively kind of abolish the model-based component if there really are two things. So we can, by loading the subject's kind of working memory, sort of prefrontal resources, you imagine we're distracting him. He can't do the kind of deliberation, but he can still do kind of automatic reinforcement learning. This is a simpler approach, and that's indeed what we see. So it's not that subjects are distracted by dual tasks to the point that they don't do anything. If anything, they're a little bit better at the model-free strategy, but there's no longer any significant model-based behavior. So we were able to selectively abolish one of the components of the behavior while maintaining the other, suggesting that there's a real distinction here that we're thinking about it right. We can also look at a different way of modulating the trade-off between these two sorts of learning, which starts to get at the question of how the charioteer works, or the control strategy. And that comes back to the prediction I told you about at the beginning, that if the outcomes of the slot machines are changing more rapidly, then subjects sort of perpetually in a kind of lower data situation, and they face more pressure to do more deliberation. So they should be less model-free or more model-based. So we did a slow and a fast manipulation, again, within subjects. So in back and forth between blocks, in half the blocks, the rewards were changing slowly. In half the blocks, they were changing more rapidly. Slow condition looks like before. Subjects have a mixture of model-based and model-free. And in line with our prediction, in the fast condition, which is quite subtly different in terms of the reward statistics, subjects are significantly more model-based. So this was a sort of novel prediction of the theories that seems to be borne out in experiments. We can, again, kind of dissociate in the other way now these two strategies and promote the one at the expense of the other in a kind of way that speaks to the nature of the decision theoretic trade-off the subjects are making, the charioteer is making in controlling which system controls behavior. So in the fast situation, the subjects seem to rely on the control strategy that's more appropriate under the circumstances.
So what does that state probability chart look like in the fast system?
I have it. I'd have to. It looks like. I mean, it looks more like it's got more of this and less of this. I switched to these. I'm not hiding anything. It's people find the 4-bar ones hard to look at. I can pull it up later, but yes, it looks like it's got a bigger interaction in it. Okay, so finally we come to the brain. So now that we've been able to kind of convince ourselves that these two learning strategies really are distinct behaviorally and that we can tease them apart, we can recognize when subjects are using one or the other, which subjects are using one or the other. Now we can ask, can we see this distinction in the brain as well, at least grossly? And the expectation, of course, all this grew out of a kind of critique of the standard prediction error models of the striatal bold response and the dopaminergic response. And so our expectation is that we have this kind of two-channel system, and one of the channels is associated with the striatal bold response and the dopamine and prediction error and all that, and the other is going to be somewhere else. Now, this is kind of the mixture model question. In doing this sort of analysis, we can fit a more detailed model of the choices. I don't want to belabor this, but we can fit reinforce the temporal difference learning model on the one hand and a model-based reinforcement learning model on the other, looking not just one trial back now, but back over many trials, averaging according to those exponential decays, learning values for each option, and then assuming that the subjects put them together in some mixture, some weighted mixture. Now, for the purpose of these studies, we assume that that weighting is not itself learned. It's a parameter that we fit. So different subjects have different extents to which they rely on the model-based or model-free values. And we fit that parameter as we fit the whole model to their choices. So at the end, you get choice probabilities out for each option. The two models, because they learn differently, predict different trial-by-trial sequences of which option the subjects prefer, and we can fit all the free parameters and estimate what we think at each trial these different values are and the weights are. Okay? Okay, so having done that, we can do a few kind of standard analyses in fMRI that will be hopefully telling. And one is the following. So we now have at least a model and fit to behavior of what we think each of these putative systems knows about the values of the two options at each timestamp. Right? So we can go back to the model and simulate on the subject's actual experience with the best fitting parameters, and it gives us a value for each action for each system at each time. Okay? It's an estimate of what we think the systems know. If these two things are different centers in the brain, then those values the neural correlates of those values might be dissociable. And it so happens that in the bold signal, it's been known for a long time that for whatever reason, if you do a similar trick to what I described before, and you write down a time series of values, like what we think the subject thinks they're going to get on a particular trial for their option, for their choice, then you see that time series co-varies with activity in a number of areas, especially the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, most famously, orbital frontal cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex above it, and also in some cases, more sort of cingulate areas, in this case, a posterior supplemental motor area. This second area is seen less often. This one is quite ubiquitous, and this one has come up a couple times in our hands in these tasks that require more deliberative planning, which may explain what I'm going to tell you next. So this is just, these are areas in which the bold signal correlates with the average of what we think the model-based and model-free systems think the value is. But I can now ask a finer question, which is which value signal better explains each of these signals. And the expectation is that if these are really two neurally separate entities that are described by this computational model, we should be able to dissociate them neurally as well, and that is indeed the case. So what we see is that model free value, the dopamine prediction error temporal difference one, is in this kind of axis in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex along the dopaminergic protection. That one fits model free value. This one fits model-based value, this more posterior supplemental motor area response. So we have a neural separation with two responses which are different from one another and which better match the two different models of evaluation that are fit to the behavior. So everything kind of lines up. Regarding this kind of more posterior activation, this is an area that's kind of classically involved in motor sequencing and motor planning, so it may make sense that it's involved in this kind of multi-step deliberation in this task. Whereas this area is involved in all kinds of reward tasks, like the ones that we've used that don't really involve deliberation at all. So again, it might make sense. Okay, so that's great. So we can dissociate different cortical areas associated with these two valuation signals. Again, it seems like we're on the right track. And I remind you that we can see a signal, particularly ventral striatum, that looks like the prediction error that people look at also in terms of the dopamine response. And the prediction of the theory is that these are sort of two channels that are separate. So this prediction error should go with the TD kind of model-free model. So if we do the same kind of trick we did before and ask, is this more model-based or more model-free, this prediction error is this sort of model-free system. It's supposed to be, and we should be able to see it staying exclusively on one side of that divide. So we ask that question here as we write down a prediction error time series under the traditional temporal difference learning model for the model-free prediction error, and then we ask, how would that time series change if it were actually a prediction error with respect to the predictions made by the model-based model? So the model-based model makes different value predictions, so it makes different prediction errors. The difference between the model-based prediction error and the model-free prediction error is how it would change if I added the one to the other. And I estimate a linear model of the bold response. The expectation is you get this loading in striatum, the model-free prediction error, but none of the thing that you would add to it to turn into a model-based prediction error. If you do get significant model, this sort of change component, that means the bold signal striatum is better accounted for by either some combination of the two signals or by model-based reinforcement learning, which is not what we expected, but is actually what we found. So the contrary to the traditional story of this kind of isolated prediction error circuit, what we saw is that the temporal difference error, the pure one, does indeed correlate well with ventral striatum, but in the same voxels, you do have significant effect of the thing that wants to add it to this one produce a net signal that's got model-based reinforcement learning in it. So we don't have a pure model-free prediction error signal. We have a kind of mixture or model-based prediction error signal. In fact, what we have is a mixture where across subjects now, the extent to which there's model-basedness in this striatal signal tracks behaviorally how model-based they are in their choices. So this is significant, although not incredibly impressive scatter plot. But it is significant. We have subjects who, on the one end, behave like pure reinforcement learners. They have no model-based component. They just look like that main effect without interaction. On the other side, we have subjects who are perfect model-based reinforcement learners, everything in between. And if you scatter plot the parameter estimates from the bold data against parameters from the behavioral data, you see a correlation. So what that says is across subjects, to whatever extent the behavior is model-based, so is the bold signal. That is, the bold signal in striatum, even at this level, the level that's supposed to be the pure reinforcement learning system, already reflects the sort of behaviorally relevant mixture of the two influences. So I think I'm running out of time. Let me say one or two more things. So this suggests a kind of surprising convergence of this kind of top-down deliberative information onto what was supposed to be this kind of implicit kind of reinforcement system. That somehow it's this sort of frontal, putatively frontal supplemental motor area kind of deliberative influences are actually taking over not just the behavior. They're not just competing to control the choices, but also competing to control the prediction or the reinforcement signal. So it's kind of interesting interaction that we hadn't expected and that we're now thinking about models of. Okay. I think in the interest of time, I might skip this just to say, putting the two results I've shown you back together, we see that, remember, we have two value signals in cortex, and we have kind of one value signal in striatum, or one prediction error signal in striatum. It is indeed the case that across blocks, as we shift subjects' behavior using the volatility manipulation to make them more or less model-based, we shift the effective connectivity measured by correlation between these different value areas in striatum. So it seems as though these signals really do they're self-consistent in a way that's consistent with being wired up, that these separate value systems come together in striatum. Although, of course, in fMRI, we can't speak to causality or direction of connections. But the correlational structure changes with condition in a way that the striatum becomes more connected to the model-based structures in this situation where the subjects are more model-based. Also, just to quickly say, of course, this is the bold signal. It's not dopamine, but there are some indications also that dopamine neurons in monkeys know things that a model-based reinforcement learning would know, but simple temporal difference learning wouldn't. So this is something about the structure of a repeated reversal task that Bromberg-Martin has reported from Hikosaka's lab, that dopamine neurons themselves are doing something more fancy than just temporal difference learning, sort of consistent with our story, too. OK, so I want to end with one thing. And this is really new and just a first brush, but I think it's exciting. And so coming really back to the charioteer and to self-control and to Plato, if I may, is it really the case that this kind of obscure computational distinction we've elucidated here maps onto this idea of compulsion? And in particular, we thought, we took a broad brush approach to this and looked at different subjects with different disorders involving compulsion very, very generally. So my collaborator Valerie Voon in England and many of her collaborators in England gathered up a large number of different patient groups, the three I'll show you, all of whom have disorders that in some way arguably involve compulsion, and did our task on them. And the question is, are they different with respect to this kind of learning axis? So the healthy volunteers, the matched control groups for these three groups, they all look the same, so I plotted them on one plot. Look like our original subjects. They have a mixture of model-based and model-free reinforcement learning. But if you look at these patients, they're quite different. So these are subjects with binge eating disorder, which is a compulsive eating disorder, but not bulimia, which is important for eating researchers, I guess. They're basically purely model-free. So they're kind of the pure reinforcement learners, the Thorndike TD creatures. They don't seem to have any model-based contribution at all on our task. Stimulant abusers, these are either methamphetamine or cocaine abusers who've been abstinent for at least a week in a treatment center. Same deal. So they have only model-based learning and only model-free learning and no model-based learning. They also looked at OCD. I think OCD is a less good example of a less good prediction because it's not really compulsion in the same way, the kind of reinforcement way, arguably. But even there's an attenuation of model-based reinforcement learning relative to model-free reinforcement learning. So in all of these patient groups, they seem to have this commonality that whether this is cause or effect, of course, we don't know. But our task seems to distinguish that they're more driven by this model-free reinforcement mechanism, which is supposed to be the one associated with compulsion, with drug abuse, with the reinforcing actions of drugs of abuse, and so on. So I think this is, of course, needs additional work to really flesh out. But I think it's exciting that this computational distinction seems to be mapping onto something with actual relevance to the real world. And that's the last point I want to make. So in conclusion, we try to distinguish two different strategies for reinforcement learning in humans. We showed that we can manipulate their prevalence in different ways. We can study how they vary both spontaneously across subjects if we manipulate them, and in these disorders, that they seem to have a meaningful relationship to these disorders. And we see neurally that the architecture is a little different than we expected. They're associated with distinct cortical regions, but it seems like both of these evaluation processes converge at the level of striatal prediction error, suggesting that somehow they're competing to control the learning or reinforcement signal as well as the decisions themselves. And this brings us to the bigger issues we're still working on. So this question of arbitration or the charioteer or the interaction, we're just starting to get at. We have a sort of theory of how it should work, but we're only starting to test it. But that's really the key for drugs, right? Can you cure drug abuse by turning down the gain of one of these systems, turning up the other, and rescue these habits? The other question is how this more computationally framed model relates to these. I've said that this idea of dual systems is ubiquitous throughout psychology and history. So are we really all talking about the same thing? So this is in psychology, people talk about moral reasoning a lot this way and time discounting. Does our distinction correspond to those? And we just don't know yet. So these, again, are the people who did a lot of the work, Sam and Ross and Dylan in particular. And thanks a lot.
Skinner would say that what you have here is prior probabilities like in imprinting, and then shaping by induction, because you still have a black box. Even though you say there is system 1 and system 2, the result is that it's shaping.
I mean, it is. I mean, we're looking deliberately at learning guided by reward. So it's behavior, since we're looking at behavior and we're looking at outcomes. But the argument, going back to Tolman and the other people who attacked the behaviorists, is that the behavior demonstrates some kind of internal representation of, in this case, the transition structure. In Tolman's case, the spatial maze, the cognitive map, that can't be explained in terms of these pure kind of model-free reinforcement processes. I'm not sure.
Why not? If you have prior probabilities, like in imprinting, you have a certain way that it started. And then this way that you start, the expectation of a reward, is then shaped by induction.
I mean, I'm not sure. Perhaps you're describing a similar model to what we're describing, but I'm not sure I know exactly. But it's I think that the behavior has to be explained by a representation. I'm not sure why you're calling it what you're calling it, but a representation of the consequences of actions and not merely their reinforcement status. So it's not explicable on Thorndikean terms.
To what extent you predict? I think there is an oversimplification in attributing the reward signal to TDO solely, etc.
Sure.
So to what extent, I have an idea for an experiment. To what extent you think that if I put two subjects, one who tends to be more organized, more German type of personality, and the other more Israeli, you put them under the same task, and maybe you teach them not 2 steps, but you teach them a maze, something like that. You need several steps, a long set of steps, and of course, if you start a long maze when you know it very well after you learned it, you have a reward signal at the very, very first entrance to the maze, right? You know that you get your reward. So this is a
TD0. Yeah.
So it's not that simple that one is model free and one is model based.
So I think.
Maybe it's just the element of interactions that you refer to, but.
Yeah. So we've done maze tasks as well, and we've seen a similar result. I think the point here, I believe, so the temporal difference story where you get a predictive reward signal is a fancier model-based algorithm. So if you have a series of outcomes and those have been themselves promoted with reward, you learn values about all of them, and you can drive a prediction error as soon as you encounter a better than expected state. So in this experiment, you already have that because you could have a prediction error here before you get the reward, and that could drive learning here. But that prediction error is based on itself on experience of rewards on previous trials, and this is a famous chaining process that is in these models. That's all accounted. I elided that for the purpose of exposition and talked about the variant of TD learning that doesn't have that, but we've tested for that. That's included in our model-free. That is, in the generalized model-free case, you interpolate between reinforcing at the end and reinforcing along the way, but is reinforcement the same? So we have an additional parameter that characterizes that distinction. Both of those are significant. There's both kinds of reinforcement. These plots don't reflect that because the TD0 component, the chaining component, takes at least 2 trials to chain back from the outcome to the choice, because you learn about the one on trial T and learn about the next one on trial T plus 1. So it's got to chain 2 steps. So that these one trial back regressions are blind to that, but the full model prediction is not. And we're taking that into account.
Now, can you comment on the similarity between obsessive compulsive? Were they most affected?
I think the cleanest example is the. Sorry.
Eating disorders. Okay.
Yeah, these guys are the best. Also, another group has data on problem gamblers that look just like this. So I don't. So she threw.
Just different personalities.
So we've tried. Oh, sorry. Someone asked that, and I didn't. Did you say that? Sorry. Yeah. So we've tried various. I had a personality psychologist come and do a battery of things. Extroversion predicts model freeness. I don't know, is extroversion what you call Israeli? It's not quite the same thing as Germanness versus Israeliness, but so extroversion and introversion maybe predicts model baseness. Extroversion and introversion predicts more or less model free, and introversion introversion is the opposite of extroversion. The other one is neuroticism, which is sort of I'm not a personality psychologist, but it's sort of I think it's sort of how afraid you are and how much you spend time deliberating, basically, and that predicts model baseness a bit. What's that?
How close you are to Woody Allen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Woody Allen, we predict, is very model based, and not a binge eating problem. So we have some results of that sort. So it does seem like, and that there's previous results that reinforcement learning is related to extroversion and extroversion related to dopamine. So it kind of all lines up. I'm not totally sure I'm totally sold on these questionnaires as telling you something fundamental about neurobiology, but it's definitely interesting. And OCD, sorry, I think you also asked a question about OCD. I think this is less, I mean, I'm not, again, an OCD person. I think the stimulant abuse, the drug abuse story, problem gambling, problem eating, really have this story about runaway reinforcement, right? It's really about, I've done something I've been reinforced before, and it gets out of control. So that fits very well with the idea that you have a runaway reinforcement system. OCD is not really like that, I think. I don't know what it is, but it's not. It doesn't have quite that same character. And indeed, this effect is more marginal, this difference. So I wouldn't make as much of this one, but I think these two, there's really something going on.
Regarding this, just Parkinsonian should be reversed, though.
Yeah, it might interact with medication too. So we have a grant to look at that, but we haven't.
But the question is, your bone signal was very limited to the ventral striatum. Nothing in the dorsal striatum?
Yeah, so that's a funny thing about this. That's very characteristic of this kind of analysis. And I mean, there's dozens and dozens of studies of variations of this task, and looking at prediction errors. The focus of it is always ventral striatum. Sometimes it's more putamen, sometimes it's more accumbens, and sometimes it kind of rides up into the putamen. But the focus is always ventral, and I don't know sort of what to make of that. But I mean, the bold signal is not dopamine, right?
Yeah, but model-based should.
Okay. Oh, no, go ahead. So you would no, I wouldn't have thought that model-based would be here, right? So the rat story suggests that model-based is up here, and we don't see anything. We see kind of both influences here. But the tool is the tool. It's what we're looking at is not even clear, right? It's oxygen metabolism, and but this is a well-described activation, and the active properties of this activation, seem to follow these models in an interesting way. But what we didn't see and expected to see, of course, was exactly that you have a kind of breakdown across striatum, that, like we do across cortex, of different areas associated with different systems, but we don't see that.
I have a question about the separation between model-based and model-free learning. And my question is there really model-free learning, in the sense that if you take your subjects and put them on a lower or slightly not change the location of the target. They will not make exactly the same action, right? They will immediately adapt to choose the target as you instructed them to do. So they don't really learn the action. They learn something which is more high level. So
Yeah.
so in that sense, it's not clear to me that one can really talk about the separation of two systems in the sense that all model-free learning have a component of model-based learning. In that sense, it's not clear to me how you get separation of systems.
So I'm not
It's
sure.
a question of level of abstraction.
So I think, as usual, and there's distinctions that cross-cut the one I'm trying to make. So without even thinking about state, which is an important, so I've left state out of these equations. Right? Let's just leave that out. So the question really is, what's this action? And is it the case that if this action is more abstract, is that properly thought of as model-based versus model-free? And I guess what I would say is that the question of the action space over which these algorithms or these systems work is quite complicated and not solved. So at the, you could have ballistic motor actions on the one hand, and you can have taking the bus to the airport on the other hand. And there is a hierarchy of actions, but I think the question of what plugs into the action slot in these equations, and what you learn about the actions, what you map them to, whether you map them directly to propensities or values, or whether you map them via outcomes to outcomes, that's the model-based, model-free distinction. I don't think that more abstract actions are necessarily model-based. I think that you could have both kinds of learning over both kinds of action representations. So Matt Bavinnik and Yael Niv have worked a great deal on hierarchical reinforcement learning, which is really the question of how do you define the action? How do you build up complex actions from elemental ones? And there's a story there which is entirely model-free, but it chunks actions together into sequences, essentially, that become kind of macro actions, and then you do reinforcement learning over that. So there's a kind of hierarchy of more chunked and less chunked actions within a kind of traditional TD, otherwise traditional TD story. In fact, the whole dopamine prediction error thing it holds up in that situation, at least in models. So I think that's an important question, but I would reject the assertion that that means it's more model-based. It is true that it's different from the kind of simple kind of stimulus-response reflex kind of Thorndikean idea that the rat wiggles his paw in a particular way and that movement is stamped in. But we already know that the loops of striatum are more and less bound to particular motor action. There's more cognitive loops and more motor loops, and so perhaps reinforcement learning in the more cognitive loops works over these higher level, more chunked behaviors. That's a possibility.
Okay, thank you, speaker.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
The initial results that you showed were actually the one trial made me think. Like my simplest explanation would be the rare events are just ignored. Think about it. A simple reinforcement, except that when you see something you're not expecting, it's ignored.
All right, thanks a lot. Yeah, so the first one I showed you looks like that, and indeed a number of them. I think that results from the averaging of subjects where you have significant more crossover-like patterns and significantly less crossover-like patterns, and you end up in the middle where those two things cancel out in those cells.
Meaning certain subjects actually transfer their learning from the rare.
So I mean, you have subjects that look at different. Yeah, so it's definitely the case that there are subjects for which that difference is significant. But you asked about the right one. The one where you increase the model based. If I'd shown you broken down to the 4 bars, that would have been what I've showed you to show you that's not the right answer, because they really do. There's a clear separation at the subject level average in the fast trials, where that distinction, the two red bars aren't the same. They're separate. The pattern really reverses. But yeah, it is true that unfortunately true that in the kind of default parameters for the study in the original task, that those two things cancel each other out, I think, to the, but no, yeah.
Is there another way for the population average?
I think so. I think so.
Thanks
All
for
right.
coming.
Thanks a lot. Thanks so much for having me. We should continue our discussion
Yeah.
email or something.
Let me know what you think with regard to this review thing. I think we sent you some. I don't remember.
Yeah, I think maybe we should coordinate on two.
You can turn off your microphone.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Thanks. I would have walked out with it. Who do I give?